some of this relatively quickly. Perek Daled was the sitna, the accusation, and the stopping of the building of the Mikdash for 18 years. Perek Hey is the nevuah that was given to Chagai and Zechariah that they should start building. And they started building, and again, as I said yesterday, it's very important to note that they started building without getting permission from the king. They just started building, and this is already in the second year of the reign of Daryavesh, the son of Esther. What then happened was the Persian governors of Eretz Yisrael, sees that they're starting building, and they're a little concerned because they know that Koresh had issued an interdiction, and that was reconfirmed by Achashverosh as well. So they go to the Jews and they say, "Who told you to start building?" So the answer that the Jews said was, well, Koresh had authorized it many years before, and we're simply carrying out Koresh's original decree, which is really a non-answer. It's really a non-answer simply because, yeah, Koresh gave the decree, but Koresh also withdrew, but that's what they said. So the governors, who are not, by the way, the governors are not identified as the enemies. There are Tzorei Yehuda Benyamin that are the Samaritans. The governor, whose name is Tatnai, his name is given, Tatnai and Boznai, these are the governors of the area, they are simply playing the role of bureaucrat, and they know that the Jewish people are engaged in construction in violation of Koresh's last order, reconfirmed by Achashverosh. So they sent a letter to Daryavesh in Persia, basically saying, this is what the Jews have done, and they claim that Cyrus had originally authorized it. Daryavesh then conducts his own investigation into the royal archives, which for some reason were kept in Bavel. This is actually a relatively interesting idea because the capital is no longer Bavel, the capital is Shushan. And Daryavesh Hasheni uncovers the fact that apparently it had been forgotten that Koresh had allowed them to build the Beis Hamikdash, and as a result, Daryavesh Hasheni gives them permission to resume, and in the typical heavy-handed Persian way, he says, this is my order, and anyone who violates this order, his house shall be destroyed, and he shall suffer grievous punishment. So it is a fascinating point that we didn't wait until the king gave us permission. We took the initiative first. And as I say, people do raise issues even today about rebuilding the temple. Should we just do it first? So again, one could say, well, this is a different case because this was authorized by Chagai and Zechariah. But I'll tell you the truth. The problem is this, though. In the book of Ezra, it just says Chagai and Zechariah had a nevuah. It doesn't even say what the nevuah was. But if you look in the book of Chagai, the nevuah was b'derech teichacha. Meaning by that I mean, Chagai, not Zechariah, Chagai is criticizing the Jewish people for not taking the initiative earlier. See, it's a little different. To say that this works only because of prophetic authorization, that would have made sense if the nevuah would have said, now is the time to build. So the implication might be, until I get that reshus, it's wrong to build. But if the nevuah takes the form, why have you waited so long? Is it not the implication of the Musar that they should have done it first? See, you have to analyze. In other words, so to say you can't do it until you have prophetic authorization, well, if that's the case, then there's no makom for Musar. He says, how can the Navi say to me, why haven't you done it until now? My answer is, because you didn't tell me. Right? So in many, many ways, the common assumption, which I think is mashal from the Rambam too, Lamaisa, that we cannot rebuild a Beis Hamikdash until we have prophetic authorization. And the proof is because they didn't start building the Bayis Sheni until Chagai and Zechariah gave them that nevuah. And therefore, Bisman Hazeh, we have no power to rebuild the Beis Hamikdash. I'm not sure if that's 100% mukhrach, given the fact that the nevuah of Chagai was a teichacha. It was not simply saying, now you have a green light. It was a musar. Why didn't you seize the opportunity at an earlier point? But be it as it may, it is very important to note that Daryavesh granting permission is an after-the-fact permission, meaning we started building. The governors sent notice to Daryavesh that the Jews are violating the edict of Koresh renewed by Achashverosh, not to do it, but they claim that there had been an earlier order by Koresh that it's okay. Daryavesh did his investigation. Now, it's interesting. Even Daryavish's behavior is kind of interesting. Daryavesh didn't simply say, it's okay with me. He needed to verify the story by checking the archives that Koresh had authorized it. I mean, that's an interesting point in and of itself. The implication would have been that had there not been that prior permission, Daryavesh Hasheni would not have given the permission on his own. Perhaps he would have been upset that the Jews are, violating the edict without getting permission first. I don't know, but it is interesting that Daryavesh Hasheni was toile on what Koresh had done 18 years before. Okay, be it as it may, so we're now in the second year of Daryavesh. We are now 18 years after Koresh withdrew his permission. The reign of Achashverosh was in the middle. The Purim story was in the middle of all of this. And the construction extended for 4 years. Okay, so this is important. We were given permission, or we started building and were given permission in year 2 of Daryavesh. And the second Mikdash was completed in year 6 of Daryavesh, in the month of Adar, interestingly enough. We often don't think of the month of Adar as a month of the dedication of the Beis HaMikdash. Again, just to remind you, the Mishkan was dedicated Nisan, Rosh Chodesh Nisan. Shlomo HaMelech's Beis HaMikdash was dedicated in the month of Tishrei. Yom Kippur, Sukkot were the dedication ceremonies. In fact, that year they ate on Yom Kippur, right? The dedication of the second Beis HaMikdash was in the month of Adar. And then later, when the Hanukkah story happens and there's a desecration of the second Beis HaMikdash, it's not destroyed, it gets rededicated the 25th of Kislev, which is Hanukkah. But that was not the dedication of a new Beis HaMikdash. That was the existing Bayit Sheni that had been desecrated and the like. So Adar is actually the dedication of the Bayit Sheni in the 6th year of Daryavesh. Now, again, a little bit of a point I know that you've heard over the years, and I've said it many times, and I'm sure you've heard it anyway, that the duration of the first Beis HaMikdash is 410 years. The duration of the second Beis HaMikdash is 420 years. Both of them were destroyed on the 9th of Av. But you have to keep in mind that when you count the 410 and the 420, you are including the years of construction. So the 420 years from the building of the second Mikdash until the Chorban is counted from the second year of Daryavesh, not the 6th year. Even though we didn't have a full Beis HaMikdash until year 6, you are counting it from year 2. And the same thing with Shlomo HaMelech, right? The first Beis HaMikdash also took several years to construct, but you're running it from construction. Now, Lemais, I do have a little bit of a kasha on that, because if you're counting it from the beginning of construction, then one might have made an argument we should count it 18 years more than that, because they actually started construction when they lay the foundation, right? So mimanavshach, if you're counting it from the beginning of construction, you would add 18 years earlier than that. If you're counting it from completion, you would count it from the completion, which is year 6. So instead of 420, you would have only 416 years. So the counting is a little inconsistent, but nevertheless, the way Chazal come up with the 420, and this can be proven, is they are counting from year 2, even though it was not completed until year 6. Now, again, remember that we do not have any type of detailed description of what this Beis HaMikdash looked like. It was not the magnificent temple of Herod. The temple of Herod is much, much later. The temple of Herod is only a few decades before the Churban. Under Roman domination, there was a famous cartoon in the New Yorker where a patient is sitting or lying down in his psychiatrist's office, and the psychiatrist is telling him, he says, "I have very good news for you. You're not paranoid. Everybody does hate you." Paranoid thinks everyone hates him. So Herod, people often say that Herod was paranoid, but I say no. According to this cartoon, Herod was not at all paranoid. Everybody did hate him, and therefore his perception was totally accurate. Herod, it's a very strange Gemara in Bava Basra. It's a very strange story. Herod was a murderer. I mean, he killed his wives, he killed his children, he killed plenty of non-Jews, but he murdered many, many chachamim, many gedolim, many tzaddikim. And at some point, his conscience bothered him, or at least he was afraid that God was going to punish him. So he asks one of the Tanoim, how can he redeem himself? And he was given the answer, you extinguished the light of the world. You extinguished the Chachmei Torah, that with the light of the world, your kapara, so to speak, will be that you must rebuild the light of the world, which is the Beis Medrash. So, given the fact, for example, that we see in the book of Ezra, you're not even supposed to take donations from non-Jews. First of all, Herod was a non-Jew. That's one thing. That Herod was actually, it's not so pashut. Herod's status was probably that of an Eved Kanani. Herod had actually been a non-Jewish slave. Herod was an Edomite from Esav, but he had been a non-Jewish slave of the Hasmoneans. And when their Malchus fell apart, Rome appointed him as king, but that's what the Gemara says. He took, to legitimate his status, he took a Hasmonean princess as his wife, which, by the way, is a forbidden relationship. So nobody's from here, but he took a Hasmonean wife, and at some point, the Gemara says she committed suicide. She jumped off a roof, and she declared in her last words, anyone who says they come from the Hashmonaim is an Eved. Because there were no survivors of the Hasmonean dynasty other than through Herod, who had children from this woman, and they would be Avodim and the like. So Herod, so an Eved Kanani is not quite a guy. An Eved Kanani is chayiv in mitzvos, like a woman. So it could very well be that whatever issue there is to take donations from non-Jews would not apply to get donations from an Eved Kanani. Okay, so we can get around that problem. But still, the one thing that's clear is Herod was an absolute Russia. So it's a little peculiar that the Chachamim should actually encourage such a Russia to be involved in the tremendous beautification of the Beis HaMikdash. Meaning, even if it's not a problem of a goy, because he was Eved Kanani, right? So that might be an answer to that. But why are you getting a Russia involved in this? Almost as if Herod is hearing, although Rav Yehuda ben Baba didn't quite say that, but Herod is hearing, this will be an atonement. It reminds me a little bit, although Lahavdil reminds you a little bit of after the Holocaust. So the Germans, to this day, there's still some old people receiving them, made tremendous amounts of reparations. And a lot of the cabs, even to this day, and a lot of the buses are German-made, Mercedes, whatever it is, BMWs. And these were made available to the state of Israel and various private individuals as kind of an atonement or an apology for the Holocaust. But there were many people, there were many survivors who refused to take any type of reparation for what was done. Again, I'm not giving you a psak. I'm just giving you a fact. They refused to take any money. They considered it to be blood money, and they considered it to be almost saying, now that you've given us taxis and given us cabs and given us money, so now let bygones be bygones. Everything is now okay. And they considered the Holocaust to be such an unforgivable crime that you can't really erase it by money. All right, it's a big machlokas. Some people say, well, listen, These are not the Nazis that are giving it to you. They're their successors. I mean, are you going to blame the grandchildren and the great-grandchildren for what was done? Okay, it's a debate. But be it as it may, Herod himself is the Nazi. Herod himself is the bad guy. So it's like Hitler offering you money. I think that even the people who accepted German reparations wouldn't take an offer from Hitler himself had such a thing been offered. So I don't have an answer. It's genuinely perplexing to me, and even spiritually. Why would Hashem use Herod to be the vehicle to rebuild the Beis Hamikdash? Herod was mamish, a very, very bad guy. He was really, really a Russia. Nevertheless, the point that you need to understand is that when you see the magnificent Second Temple, you are seeing pictures of the Herodian Temple. That is not the Beis Hamikdash that was dedicated in the reign of Dariush, which by all accounts was a much simpler structure. Now, obviously, the basics you had. You had a courtyard that's called an Azara. You had a Mizbeach in the courtyard. You had a building that is called the Heichal. And the back third of the building was the Kodesh HaKadoshim. So, you had the basics that you needed, but it was simple. And the Herodian temple was vast and expanded. And Chazal even say, anyone that did not see the temple of Herod did not see a beautiful building in their lifetime. In fact, it was so beautiful as a building that Titus didn't want to destroy it. Josephus records this. Titus is the Roman general who later became emperor, but Titus was the actual general who was in charge of destroying the Beis Hamikdash. And, who knows, Josephus, well, a word about Josephus for a moment, just so you'll know who I'm talking about. Josephus is the Greek or Latin name for Yosef ben Matisyo HaKohen. Not the Chanukah Matisyo, although the name probably came from that. And Yosef ben Matisyo HaKohen was a Jewish guy and a very, very interesting person. Initially, he was a general in the war against Rome. He fought against the Romans. And at some point, he surrendered. He saw that the war was fruitless, we would not succeed. So he actually surrendered himself to the Romans. And for the duration of the war, which culminated in the destruction of the Second Temple, he actually lived in Rome under the protection of Titus, initially the general, and then who became the emperor and the like. Josephus then proceeded to write a number of historical works in Greek that were later translated into different languages. He wrote one work on biblical history, meaning kind of giving you the historical events of the Torah, Nevi'im, and Kesuvim with different chazals, although he doesn't bring all midrashim, but it's kind of a history. But then he also wrote the work on the Jewish rebellion against Rome, the civil war, not the civil war, but the war against Rome, which culminated in the Churban Beis Hamikdash. Now, Josephus gives you a lot of information that is not in the Gemara about the actual details of the battles and the Churban Beis Hamikdash and the like. Now, the question is, how do we regard Josephus? And how does a traditional Jew regard Josephus? So the truth is, he was controversial from the beginning of his career. Many Jews looked at Josephus as a traitor, as a Benedict Arnold, as somebody who simply went over to the enemy. Others look at Josephus as actually expressing the hashkafa of Chazal. Because what was Chazal's own attitude towards the war against Rome? Chazal were frankly against it. Chazal were situationally pacifistic. They're not pacifistic legamri, but they basically said, we are not on the madrega to fight against Rome. And if we simply surrender to the Romans, they will at least let the Beis Hamikdash stay. So in a sense, Josephus was a traitor. He went over to the enemy. But at the same time, the philosophy that he was expressing was in fact the philosophy of Chazal, that we're not supposed to wage war, at least in that circumstance. Again, this is not a general statement, But just like Yirmiyahu, same thing in the first Beis Hamikdash. Yirmiyahu gave us prophecies not to wage war against Babylonia, stating that that will result in the Churban. And hundreds of years later, Chazal, Rav Yochanan ben Zakkai, says not to wage war against the Romans. Better to be oppressed, better to pay taxes, and have a Beis Hamikdash and be able to learn Torah, than to fight a war that for sure you're going to lose. Chazal saw that we would not be Menachem. So Josephus is of two. People view him in different ways. Is he a traitor? Is he a person that had the emistic of perception of how to deal with reality? But then you get a second question. How do I look at his histories? Are his histories accurate or not? Because remember, he's kind of writing history under a gun to his head. He is sitting in Rome writing the history of the Jewish rebellion against Rome. So there are two things that's going on. He actually has to make the Romans look a little better than we might otherwise perceive them to look at. So he paints Titus, in whose house he was living. He paints Titus in a bit of a positive way. A bit of a positive way. He also paints the Jewish revolutionaries in a very negative way. But again, Chazal did the same thing. And Josephus made the claim throughout his life that he wrote his books so that the Jewish people themselves would not be disparaged. In other words, his idea was the war against Rome was a small group of fanatics and did not represent Am Yisrael. So some people say those are false apologetics. But in truth, if you learn the Gemara in Gittin, what Josephus is saying is not far from the truth. There were the hot-headed revolutionaries who wanted to wage war against Rome, not for religious reasons, for political reasons. And Chazal were against it. So, with all of this back and forth, the bottom line is that Josephus is probably fairly accurate, even though he wrote it with a gun to his head. But Josephus is regarded as a legitimate source of history, but you got to take it with a grain of salt. Okay, like anything else. But as long as he's not contradicting Chazal, you can use it for supplementary information. Now, I'm bringing this up because Josephus remarks that Titus himself did not want to destroy the Beis Hamikdash. And not because of religious reasons, not because he had Yiras Hashem, that wasn't the issue, but simply because it was such a magnificent building that he just didn't want to destroy it. But what happened was, according to Josephus, the soldiers were out of his control. The soldiers just started doing stuff, and at some point, even Titus could not stop it. Is that true? Is that not true? We don't know. That might be one of the things that Josephus wants to paint Titus in a more positive way, but it's possible that is true. Josephus has another quote attributed to Titus that's also very interesting, and that is, during this war, there were many, many factions within the Jewish people that they were fighting against each other for various control. In fact, Josephus describes a scene that Kohanim are still bringing korbanos in the Beis Hamikdash, and there are warring factions of Jews who are shooting arrows to each side, and the Kohanim are walking under the arrows to bring korbanos. That's actually the meaning. The temple was destroyed because of sinas chinam. It doesn't just mean I didn't like you. It means there were these wars within the Jews. So Titus is said to have said, I don't know if I have to destroy the temple at all. If I just wait long enough, the Jews will destroy it themselves. Again, is that true? I mean, was that said, or is that a made-up quote? No idea. Maybe it's made up. But once again, it does express the idea that Chazal say that the Bayis Sheni was destroyed because of sinas chinam. Okay? But be it as it may, Josephus was a witness to the destruction of the Herodian temple. But the Beis Hamikdash of Ezra and Nehemiah was a much simpler structure, and we simply do not know exactly. Now, the Hanukkah dedication did not involve significant reconstruction. They had to repair it, but essentially that was still the Ezra and Nehemiah. Actually, not Ezra's not here yet, but Nehemiah is here, but essentially the Zerubbabel, we call it the Zerubbabel Beis HaMikdash. The Chanukah Beis HaMikdash is essentially the Zerubbabel Beis HaMikdash that underwent maintenance and repair. One more thing about Josephus. It's interesting that there is a Hebrew sefer called Sefer Yosiphon. Sefer Yosiphon. And Rashi brings, in a few places, Sefer Yosiphon. And the author of Sefer Yosiphon is said to be Yosef Ben Gurion, not to be confused with the later Ben Gurion. So what is the relationship between Josephus and Sefer Yosiphon? Because it's not exactly the same. So historians are a little uncertain about this. But essentially, the consensus is that Sefer Yosiphon is a Middle Ages work, which is based on Josephus, augmented with other different types of stories. So Yosiphon is not Josephus, but Yosiphon is an adaptation and an augmentation of Josephus. Now, there is an older view that Yosiphon was Josephus's original work in Hebrew that later was translated in Greek, but it's not logical. It's much more mistabra that Josephus's original work was in Greek, because that was the language he was writing for the Goyim. He was not writing for the Jews. He was writing for the Goyim. And even in Rome, which is interesting, where Latin was the language, but Greek was the more refined language. So the truth is, the literary language in a lot of Rome was in fact Greek, even though Latin was the spoken language. So Yosiphon is based on Josephus, but it's not exactly the same. And Yosiphon also brings in many midrashim, many supplementary stories. Okay, so that's kind of where we're at, that the second Mikdash, the construction began the second year of Dariyavesh Hasheni, and it concluded the 6th year, and that is not to be confused with the Herodian temple. And we count the 420 from the 2nd year, not from the 6th year, right? Okay. Now, there is one other point I want to go back to, and that is, there seems to be two different ways of viewing the Bayis Sheni. If you remember, when we looked at the book of Daniel, and Daniel had visions. Now remember, just to remind you, interestingly enough, Daniel is not counted as a Navi. Daniel's book is not in the Nevi'im. Daniel's book is in the Kesuvim. Now, why is Daniel not a Navi? Daniel has all sorts of visions about the future. So if you remember the answer, the definition of a Navi is not a person that has visions. The definition of a Navi is a person who is commanded by God to communicate those visions to people, to the Jewish people, to other nations, to individuals. Daniel was never commanded to communicate his visions. God gave him all sorts of visions, but God didn't tell him, go out and tell Bnei Yisrael about these visions. That's why Daniel is not a Navi, he's in the Kesuvim, even though he had visions. But in one of the visions of Daniel, you may recall that he was told that God said, I am decreeing 70 weeks. I hereby decree on Yerushalayim Shivim Shavuos, 70 weeks. What is the meaning of 70 weeks? What are the Shivim Shavuos? So Rashi and virtually all Mefarshim say that the meaning of Shavua does not mean a week of days, but Shavua means a week of years, a Shemitah cycle. So the word Shavua can sometimes mean 7 days, but it can also mean 7 years. So 70 weeks is 490 years, right? If a week means 7 years, 70 times 7 is 490. So Daniel is told by God, Hashem has decreed on Yerushalayim 490 years. So what is the 490 years? So Rashi explains that from the time the first Beis HaMikdash was destroyed until the time that the second Beis HaMikdash is destroyed will be 490 years. How do you get to 490? Because it was 70 years from the Chorban Bayis Rishon till the second year of Daryavish, where they started rebuilding the temple. And the second temple stood for 420 years. 490 years. So that actually means that Daniel was given a prophecy or a vision that the second temple is only going to last 420 years and it's going to be destroyed. And that is way before Koresh's proclamation. Which means, according to Sefer Daniel, the second Mikdash was destined to be destroyed. It was destined to be destroyed. And indeed, we were even told when it was going to be destroyed. After the 70 years, 420 after that. And yet, there's another way of looking at the second Beis HaMikdash, that it could have been messianic had we merited it. So it's a little hard to reconcile those two ideas. Idea number one is this was destined to fail. Idea number two is this could have been the ultimate messianic temple had the Jewish people been worthy of it. So which one? So it could very well be that both are true simply because God knows the future. In other words, that's why Daniel is not a Navi. If Daniel were to communicate to us that the second temple is going to be destroyed, that would have meant it couldn't have been messianic. Hashem told Daniel the end of the story as a private revelation, meaning the second temple could have been messianic. But I'm telling you, Daniel, as a private matter, they're going to mess up and it's going to get destroyed. You see what I'm saying? In other words, it wouldn't have worked had this been a prophecy. Had there been a prophecy, the second temple is going to be destroyed after 420, then it could no longer be perceived as a possible messianic temple. But if, as far as the people are concerned, we can work to make this a messianic temple, we have an obligation to do so. Hashem happens to know the end of the story. And of course, that gets involved in the whole question of free will versus divine omniscience. How do you balance those two things? Yeah.
You know, let me say that any vision or prophecy that was it's negative, you can just shoot for.
It could be changed. Yeah. So that I think is also a good way of approaching it. Meaning, there is this negative prophecy, but that could be converted from the negative to Yemos HaMashiach. And anyway, the truth of the matter is, the meaning of the 70 weeks might only be understood in retrospect. Meaning the following: it doesn't quite say explicitly, the second temple will be destroyed after 420. It gives you a calculation of 70 weeks. Now, that could mean a whole bunch of things. When Rashi says it refers to the 490 years between the Chorban Bayis Rishon and the Chorban Bayis Sheni, it doesn't automatically mean that's how people understood it then. You see, a lot of prophecies are understood only after they happen. We then go back and say, that's what he meant. So it's not a stira, because the prophecies could assume different forms depending on how the historical outcome is going to be. Yeah.
When it comes to the destruction of the second temple, isn't there a discussion as well about the zealots being the ones who destroyed the Beis Medrash?
I'm sorry, say again there.
Isn't there a malochet on if it was Titus' army or the zealots who destroyed the second Beis Medrash?
You know, I'm not aware of that. I'll check it. The Gemara certainly says it was Titus's army, and even Josephus, Josephus absolutely blames the zealots for the destruction, but he says it was Titus's soldiers. I mean, he says because of the zealots who acted the way they acted. But I'm not aware. I'll check it. I'm not aware of any Maimer Chazal that say the zealots themselves destroyed the Beis HaMikdash. But the zealots were awful. Remember, when Rome started the siege against Jerusalem, there were enough supplies, 3 wealthy people, including Rabbi Akiva's future father-in-law, Kalba Savua, that the city could have endured the siege for 21 years. Food. The zealots wanted to precipitate an immediate armed conflict, so they burnt all of the supplies, creating mass starvation. So if Josephus looked at them in a very negative way, so did our Chachamim. So it's a funny thing. Josephus is the Benedict Arnold. On the other hand, his philosophy was very much, now was he from or not? That's still a bit of a mystery. We're not entirely clear how religious he was. He claims to have been a Talmud of the Tanoim, but everybody claims that. Paul, the Apostle Paul, says he's a Talmud of Rabban Gamliel, which might be true too, but okay. But whatever it is, we don't really know how religious Josephus was. But in his overall philosophy, condemning the zealots, he is absolutely in tune with our Chachamim. Yeah.
Was Zealots religious, or was it a mix of religious?
It was a mix. It was a mix. But obviously, they didn't have Kavod Torah, that much is so. They just rejected what the Chachamim said. They would even call them names, old man, you don't know what you're talking about.
So they're against the
Yeah, again, the zealots were not motivated for religious reasons. The zealots were not fighting, because keep in mind, when we were under Roman domination before the Churban, all of the things we learned that the Romans didn't allow you to learn Torah, didn't allow you to do a bris, that's after the Bar Kokhba revolt. Before the Churban, basically, you were free to do mitzvos. The Romans didn't care. What the Romans were doing is the Romans were imposing extreme taxation. So this was a revolt like for taxation and independence. It was not for religious reasons. We had a Beis Medrash. We could bring korbanos. We were allowed to learn Torah. One shouldn't think that the zealots rebelled against Rome because we couldn't practice Yiddishkeit. It's the other way around. Because of the rebellion that got crushed, that's when the Romans imposed all of these gezeros. And this is what the Chachamim said. The Chachamim say, hey, if you simply live in peace and accept your oppression and don't try to create political fighting, you will at least be able to keep the Torah and have a Beis HaMikdash. If you try to fight, you will be crushed. And when you will be crushed, we will lose the Beis HaMikdash, and not only lose the Beis HaMikdash, but then we'll have all the gezeros against Torah learning and the like. So people, I think, sometimes have the history in reverse. It's not that, see, this is different than the Maccabee rebellion. The Maccabim revolted because of the anti-religious laws of Antiochus. So that was a revolt in order to keep the Torah. And that's why we celebrate that revolt in some ways. We remember that revolt because that was a revolt to keep the Torah. We do not remember in any positive way the revolt of the zealots against Rome. Because again, contrary to what people sometimes think, at the time of that rebellion, at the time of that war, there was no anti-religious laws that the Romans promulgated. The Romans were oppressive, they were dictatorial, they imposed very heavy taxation, but they allowed the Jews to keep the Torah. So it was the Chachamim's opinion is, let's live with it, because the consequences in the other direction are going to be a lot worse. So this is an important point. Be sure you see the difference between the Zealots' rebellion against Rome and the earlier rebellion against Yavan by the Chashmonaim. That was a totally different type of rebellion. That was a rebellion l'shem shamayim in order to be able to keep the Torah. Okay, so now Baruch Hashem, we now have a second Beis HaMikdash completed in year 6 of Daryavesh, and here I'll just end with a question because there are a lot of questions, and the truth is, in books like Ezra, you don't have as many meforshim as you would like. So there's a lot of questions that don't get addressed, and that is, it emphasizes that Baruch Hashem, they celebrated a beautiful Pesach, Korban Pesach. Now, I don't get this at all. When they laid the foundation of the Beis HaMikdash, so it mentions they celebrated Rosh Hashanah, not Yom Kippur, Sukkot. It says nothing about Pesach at all. Now, Okay, it's Adar, so the first holiday you'll have after Adar, or the first Yom Tov will be Pesach. But why didn't it mention Pesach before? And what about those 18 years? If halachically you're allowed to bring korbanos even before you have a Beis Medrash, presumably they were bringing in korban Pesach for all of those 18 years. So why is it only mentioned after they finished in year 6? Is the intimation that they didn't bring a korban Pesach till year 6 of Yayavish? Why would that be the case if they had been bringing other korbanos? And why is Pesach mentioned only at this point and was not mentioned earlier? Right. So these are questions we'll think about. Take care.
Thank you for listening to this Ohr Somayach production. To find out more and to partner in our mission, please visit ohr.edu.